first Space Sciences Centre Hamfest, Hamfest 95, and the inauguration of the station and the antenna. I'd like to begin first by introducing Les Young from Space and Sciences Centre, who will make the first remarks.
Thank you very much, Joel. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a very great pleasure on behalf of the Edmonton Space and Science Centre to welcome you here, and especially on this formal opening of the station VE6 SSC in its present and hopefully final location. It's been quite a while getting to the location that it has, but we've now, through the efforts of a lot of people, so much equipment in it that it's not possible to keep changing it around much more. So I think it's found its final home. And a comment on that. The station was the dream and was initiated by volunteers. Those volunteers, for the most part, were members of the Northern Alberta Radio Club. And so through the many years up to 1995, it was the Northern Alberta Radio Club who shares the major proportion of the credit, responsibility, and to whom we should give thanks and due for carrying on and making this dream come true. I should mention that the station in its present larger and multi-purpose form is intended to serve amateur operators from whatever club or wherever they may be. It's intended to be a tourist attraction. We hope it will sow the seeds of the interest in amateur radio that so enthralls you folks who are members to increase the number of amateur operators in Alberta to a large degree. So we look forward to the station being a major enticement to more people enjoying the avocation that is so interesting for you. The big challenge upcoming is for the programming. But this evening I want to just note that the management or the direction of the station, which had been in the hands of the Northern Alberta Radio Club, was transferred with the continuing support of the Northern Alberta Radio Club to an advisory group formed from the volunteers, and that advisory group will probably change again, but it will still be focused on volunteers generally, and with the, we hope, support and participation of all clubs in the area. This evening I'd like to call Earl Grotsky forward, who is the treasurer of the Northern Alberta Radio Club. Is Earl here? Aha. Well, somebody from the Northern Alberta Radio Club has got to do a quick fill-in for Earl. Who's the secretary of the Northern Alberta Radio Club? That's Earl? So I was told he was the treasurer. Well,
he is the treasurer. Come on, Lord.
well, when he appears, why don't we all give him a big round of applause and you can direct him this way. He'll never know what he's missed.
Here he comes.
Here he comes. Earl! Come back. Well, I'm sorry too, Earl, that you missed all the good things that were said about you. But on behalf of the Space and Science Foundation, we'd like to present, through you, to the Northern Alberta Radio Club, this plaque, which will, for all time, indicate the appreciation of the Foundation for the efforts of the Northern Alberta Radio Club in creating station VE6 SSC.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was really nice. That's great. Okay, next I'd like to bring up the chairman of the Hamfest, Jim, V6 JDS, who has some presentations and thank yous to make to people who helped out in organizing the Hamfest.
Yeah, mainly I'd just like to say thank you, mainly to Space Science Center, throughout all the meetings that we've had over the past 6 months, forming this Hamfest, working with the advisory committee. Quite often you'd find Les, all of a sudden he gets up out of his chair, walks down the hall shaking his head and sort of muttering something about hams. I'm not sure what he means, but I think sometimes we confuse poor Les. Thank you for having patience with us, Les. Thank you for the use of your center for this Hamfest. I'm sure we've all enjoyed it. Of course, Howard Bateman, he's one, and if there's something that he doesn't understand, he says, "What'd you say? I don't understand what you're saying." And all the volunteers of the Space Science Center, they've been very, very wonderful. They run around with keys and help us out and get this for us and get that for us. So to Space Science Center, thank you very much. To all of my volunteers for the Hamfest this year, a very special thank you. Without you guys, none of this would be possible.
Thanks, Jim. Next, I'd like to introduce Elmer, V6BLO, who has a presentation to make on behalf of Arla.
How do you do? I'm the treasurer of the Amateur Radio League of Alberta. We put out a guide, and we've donated one to you, but I won't mention any names, it was forgotten, but it will be presented to you. Anyway, it's been an honor, and thank you.
Also known as W2NSD, and he's a man who certainly needs no introduction, but introduced he will be. And yesterday we spent some time together and talked about some of his experiences and activities and accomplishments, and I made several pages of notes, which I'm going to tell you all about now, so my talk will probably be longer than his talk, but because there's certainly a lot to tell you. He's an amazing person with an amazing number of accomplishments. It's a call that's been familiar to me for over 30 years when I first got into amateur radio, and so you'll see a number of things where we've, in some ways or other, crossed paths. And so it's really a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to introduce him to you this evening. First of all, I'd like to say that he's an entrepreneur and a visionary, a publisher, who has really made his mark in amateur radio and in many, many other activities, as you'll see, computing, CDs, science, technology, various other activities in his adopted state or home state now of New Hampshire. He got his start in publishing amateur radio with a magazine called Amateur Radio Frontiers in 1951, and that's before my time. I was just about 5 years old then, so wasn't reading the amateur radio literature then. But he started, as many of you know, with writing an RTTY column for CQ, and that led to him becoming I think he started that in the early 50s as well, and became the editor of CQ in 1955. His interest in building, in fact, we were talking yesterday, and he was telling me that he'd accumulated so much gear and parts and stuff that when he moved to New Hampshire, he took 4 moving vans just to move his ham radio gear to New Hampshire. So you can imagine he has accumulated a lot of stuff. So he must really be a builder. But one of the things that I found, of course, have known Wayne from is he loves contests, and I love contests, as many of you know, and he really got the CQ Worldwide contest going, which is the granddaddy of them all, one of that I certainly haven't missed in 30 years. And he got that going back in the mid-50s, and got Frank Azalone to really get the contest up and running, and it's been, of course, super successful. He's also, as many of you know, I'm a DXer, and badges up here at the top of the honor roll and so forth. But I've never gone on the expeditions, but Wayne has, and he's done a number of them, and so that must have been some interesting experiences as well. In 1960, he left CQ and went on to work in an advertising agency, and found that not too exciting, and then decided to start his own magazine. And he was a Porsche aficionado. In fact, while in the 60s, was working with the American Porsche Association, and I guess he sold his Porsche to start 73. And so he started 73 magazine to get that on the newsstands, and that's been a very successful enterprise, and of course brought a lot of construction and building to amateur radio. He was the American representative for amateur radio at the ITU conference in 1959, where there was considerable threat on the loss of our frequency privileges, HF frequency privileges, and I noted in an article he wrote recently that he said it was a fluke that saved amateur radio. I don't know what that fluke is, but I hope he'll tell us, as I've always wondered what it was that actually saved us at that time. Well, in the mid-1960s, as you know, incentive licensing came in the U.S. There were a number of changes. Many of the amateur radio businesses went out of business, 85% of them, and the manufacturers that old-timers remember, things like National, Hallicrafters, all went out of business at that time, and so it took some work, and Wayne was certainly very, very involved in rebuilding amateur radio and the industry is associated with it in the 60s after the changes that occurred to the strength we have today. In the late 60s, Wayne got, of course, involved in repeaters and published the first repeater handbook and the repeater atlas, and was very involved in bringing repeaters to the forefront we know now, and of course it was also involved in some of the experimentation that led to cellular telephones and the mechanisms that we use in the cellular telephone industry. In 1975, with the birth of the microcomputer industry, he saw the opportunities there and started a number of magazines, Byte, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, Insider, which was one that I subscribed to when I was an Apple II fan, and a number of others. When CDs became popular, he saw the opportunities there, or was just becoming popular, started the CD Review, and also got into the recording and marketing and manufacturing and distribution of CDs and records, and has several record labels. So he's really been one to identify the opportunities as they, I guess, before most other people, and been able to capitalize on them, a mark of a good entrepreneur. Well, he gave me his business card yesterday, and on this is, I've got a Xerox of it here. You probably can't see it, but it's probably got more words on it than I've ever seen on a business card. And it tells you a bit of some of the things he's interested in, and it's really quite an education to read the card. And I'll just read you some of his interests: scuba diving, skiing, cooking, travel, parapsychology, UFOs, submarines, cameras, sports cars, cosmology, healthcare, education reform, biomagnetics, and music. And as I said, he owns several record labels, including Greener Pastures and Green with Envy, and you see where those names came from. Recently, he's developed an interest in cold fusion and has started a cold fusion magazine. And as I learned yesterday, that magazine received an Aussie last year, which is the equivalent to the Emmys and Oscars in the magazine industry, for the best new technical magazine. And I know he and his wife are very, very proud of that award. He's very involved in many organizations. He's on the board of overseers of RPI, his alma mater. He's been involved in the New Hampshire High Tech Council. He's been involved in the Economic Development Council of New Hampshire and in many other organizations. He's lectured many different environments at universities and to various scientific groups, to amateur radio groups. So he's had a lot of experience at that. And one thing we can say, certainly I learned a lot more. Yes, I thought I knew something about him, but I learned a tremendous amount more. He's certainly a modern Renaissance man with a tremendous number of diverse interests, and has been able to really understand these things and develop them and bring new ideas to many of his areas of interest. So he's certainly been able to capitalize on these abilities. So it's really a great pleasure for me to have the opportunity to welcome him to Edmonton, to welcome him to Hamfest 95, and for us to hear his words, and I'm sure we'll be enlightened by what he has to say. So Wayne, please.
I believe somebody wanted to record this. Did he lose his tape recorder? What happened? Oh, well. I think you've heard all you need to hear. Any questions before I leave? How many here have been on a, pardon me for my voice, I forgot that I'm allergic to pineapple, fresh pineapple, and I ate some fresh pineapple before it disappeared, and my voice went away. How many here have been on a de-expedition somewhere? One. What am I going to do with you? Come on. The expeditions are a ball. They're fun. When you go on a de-expedition, I guarantee that you will never forget one day of it the rest of your life. And nobody's going to be able to shut you up about it either. My first de-expedition was to Navassa, pronounced Navassa down there. Anybody know where that is? 1, 2, 3. Anybody ever been to Navassa? No, of course not. Only 1 or 2 people have been on the expeditions. It's a small island, about 1 by 3 miles, halfway between Jamaica and Haiti in the Caribbean. It has no beaches. It has 100-foot cliffs all the way around the island, which is very interesting when you're trying to get on the island. Fortunately, there is a lighthouse on the island, and back when I first went there in 1958, the Coast Guard was keeping the lighthouse going by coming in occasionally and bringing in tanks of propane. So they had a steel rope ladder hanging down from a platform to the ocean. It was a little tricky getting on because these cliffs are undercut by the waves, and if you weren't careful, the small boat you're in would get sucked under there and crushed, which made it exciting. Climbing up the ladder was an experience because the steel rope ladder does not hold still when you climb, and your feet are out here. So you have to kind of chin your way up the ladder. And unfortunately, we had to haul all of the ham equipment. We had 2 complete stations along with towers, beams, rotators, generators, gasoline, and so forth. And we had to haul all those up by rope onto the island. And naturally, some of the antenna elements fell into the water. And being the only diver there, I had to go down and get them. And we had a picture. I was the editor of CQ at that time. Anybody here ever hear of CQ magazine? Okay. I was the editor, and we had a picture on the cover of the sharks cruising around there while I was diving. Well, if any scuba divers here? Okay. Those of you that are into scuba diving know that sharks are fun, and you don't worry about them. Matter of fact, I went on a diving trip one time with about 70 other divers, and all through the Bahamas, and every now and then we'd be parked there and they were giving a class on this kind of fish or that kind of fish and so forth, and somebody would surface out there that was diving and say, "Shark, shark!" and 70 people would jump overboard. On the way down to Navassa, we had a little bit of a trip. We started from Nassau in the Bahamas and sailed south and ran right into a hurricane. Now, that's interesting. The captain and I were up on the bridge, and it was so heavy, the waves were so heavy and the storm was so heavy that there was no way to go below and have anybody relieve us on watch. So we stayed up there all night. And along about 4 in the morning, I was looking carefully ahead there, and I said, "Captain, that looks like a mountain ahead." And he said, no, that's a cloud. Don't worry about it. So I know my way around here. And I said, after about 10 more minutes, I say, "Gee, that cloud sure looks like a mountain." No, don't worry about it. That's a cloud." Okay. And then about 10 minutes later, I said, "There's a car driving along that cloud." Well, we swung around quickly about 200 yards from the reefs, and we'd have been goners. So we rode out the storm by going into a little inlet by a town, and we dropped anchor, and nobody had been able to sleep with the boat rocking like that, and we all went to sleep. And about 2 hours later, I heard a screaming and yelling up topside, and people running around and yelling and so forth, and I went up to see what was going on. And here are all these black chaps with rifles and threatening everybody and yelling and screaming at them. And I found that there was a problem. It seems that these blacks from Haiti did not understand one word of English, and none of the people on our trip knew one word of French, except Wayne, who had had French in high school 20 years previously and flunked. And suddenly I was the interpreter. You wouldn't believe how fast I remembered my French. Well, I found out what the situation was. This police force from this small town had convinced themselves that we were going to invade Haiti, and they were going to kill us all and get all kinds of prizes and so forth. So I dissuaded them of that and explained that actually what we came there for was to hire 2 of them and a small boat to go over to Navassa. And as soon as hire, the word for hire in French came across, there was much volunteering. So we did take 2 of them over there to help us particularly lift all that equipment up onto the island. When we got to the island, we found that our 55-gallon drum of water had rusted out on the bottom, and there wasn't any water. Well, what the heck? We had grape juice and grapefruit juice and orange juice in cans, and we took it all onto the island. Turns out it was kind of warm there. And the juice ran out the first day, and we'd sent the boat away for about 4 days for us to do some de-Xing. So we explored the island, and we found up by the lighthouse, or pardon me, by the light, there was the remains of a lighthouse that had been blown down by a hurricane sometime, and there was just all this debris there. But we did find the cistern still there, and we brushed the scum and the green stuff off the top, and sure enough, there was water underneath. So we loaded up a couple of jugs of water and took it back down to our camp, and we had one of our chaps that was not too popular, Don Chesser, and so we explained to him that the water looked pretty good. And so we tried it on him for a day just to see. And he lived. So we had water for our stay on the island. But you need to go on a de-expedition. It's an awful lot of fun. And I've been on to a lot of rare countries now and really had a ball. And as I said, you never will forget one single day of a trip like that. And there's easy ones to get to. My gosh, there's a lot of fairly rare places down in the Caribbean that are real easy to get to. And on most of them, you don't even have to take ham gear. There's local hams that'd be delighted to have you get on and operate and handle the QSLs. Because in any rare country, that's the main problem. These poor guys can't get on the air without being hounded for QSLs or for a short contact, and it gets really boring after a while making 15-second contacts all the time. They want to talk to people. So they really like it when you come on and operate for them and take care of the QSLing. Now, we have a lot of different things in amateur radio. It is a whole bunch of hobbies, as you well know. How many of you here are on 220? 1, 2, 3. How many have operated at all on 10 gigahertz? Okay. I've been there. I've done that. I've worked 7 states on 10 GC. So,
I read your articles.
of course, the fellow that I made all the contacts with didn't cotton on to what I was doing until it was about the fourth state. And I had 4 states and he had 1. But he was good about it and went out to 7 different states, and I worked him in all 7. And so he has the record for working New Hampshire from 7 states, if that ever comes up. But we had a fun 1/10 of a watt, that's all it took. And most of the contacts were made with a simple horn antenna. There were a couple of them that were real difficult, where we used about a 3-foot dish. But most of the contacts were very simple to make. And as a matter of fact, how many of you are on 450 or 440 or anything here? You could replace your repeater links on 10 gigahertz and have very good privacy up there and do all of your relaying and control and so forth up there, and free up 450 for ATV or whatever, and not have it as congested. Of course, that's not a big problem up here. By the way, I want to thank everybody for making my visit so much fun. Sherry and I have had a ball since we've been here, and we've had a wonderful time. We got down to the Badlands, and you're right, they're bad. And I unfortunately did not bring a panoramic camera with me, otherwise I would have stretched its ability, but because the opportunity for pictures down there is fabulous. And we went to the mall, and we mulled over the mall. And we've had a lot of fun. And I had a wonderful visit over at the university, and particularly the hospital over there. Thank you, Joel. That was really great. I was very positively impressed, and almost enough to get sick. Amateur radio is a filter. You notice that the rest of Edmonton is not here. You people are the ones that have come out over and above the others. It takes a bit of work and a bit of effort to become a ham. And that's why I like to talk about the different things that are possible in amateur radio. The pioneering that can be done. The adventure. We have so many frontiers available. And as Joel mentioned, my first publication was Amateur Radio Frontiers, which was primarily radio teletype at that time. Digital communications. Back in 1950. And as a matter of fact, what happened was I got interested in that, and I kept telling everybody, hey, somebody's got to put out a newsletter. And everybody looked at me blankly. And I finally gave up in 1951. I went to work for a television station as a television director in Cleveland, Ohio. And they had a mimeograph machine. Well, that's all it took to get me started. And so I started the Amateur Radio Frontiers, and the next thing I knew, I had about 2,000 subscribers, and I had done some work. Oh, is that the tape recorder that's not over here?
Hello, test.
I'd done some work for the editor previously when he was running RASO. Anybody ever remember RASO, Radio Amateur Scientific Observations? Well, very good. You must be very old also. I was on 6 meters in Brooklyn, New York. Anybody here at Brooklyn? Okay. I was on 6 meters. And I was the only station in Brooklyn, New York on 6 meters. As a matter of fact, the only station in New York City on 6 meters at that time. And I set up a beacon, and that was used for this Radio Amateur Scientific Observations, and I had a certificate and everything. And Perry Farrell was the fellow that ran that. Well, eventually he became editor of CQ magazine. And so he approached me about running a teletype column in the magazine, and I couldn't think of any good reason not to, and I thought I might suck some more people into this fun that I was having. I have a defective gene, which I inherited apparently, and I've been able to do nothing about it. But when I'm enjoying something and having fun, I have to get out to other people and say, hey, this is fun. Come on, join me, have fun. And that's what got me doing the radio teletype newsletter. And that's what got me doing the column in CQ magazine. And I also was in the manufacturing business at that time, manufacturing a loudspeaker. And we were doing it very successfully. This was a new design of loudspeaker. I had worked for Airborne Instrument Laboratories on Long Island doing development work for the Air Force in radar. And one of the engineers working on one of my projects came up with a design for a new type of microwave antenna, which worked over a wide band of frequencies, and amazingly wide band of frequencies. And I looked at it and I said, John, you have invented a loudspeaker, because microwave and audio are the same wavelengths. If you ever thought about that. One's in air and the other is in ether. Whatever it is that radio waves are in, we don't know. And that's one of the things I'm running into in cold fusion is there an ether or not an ether? We've had some famous scientists that said, no, there isn't any ether. We haven't been able to detect it. But we have others that say, hey, we're able to draw energy from whatever this is that isn't there. Called zero-point energy. But at any rate, I, at that time, had been waiting to get a new job in television, and I had worked down in Dallas, Texas, putting KBTV on the air down there as a television director. And that's, I stayed for a while with Sherry's folks down there back in 1947, 48. And then a job came up in Cleveland, Ohio. So I gave John all of my test equipment and said, here, make a loudspeaker. And he promised to do that. Well, I worked out in Cleveland for almost a year, and I came back and the censor had not done anything. So we spent a summer building loudspeakers and designing them using this new principle. And it sounded awfully good when we got through, and we took it down to Fisher, Avery Fisher. Anybody hear of Avery Fisher? You know of Avery Fisher Hall in New York, Fisher Electronics and so forth? Well, he listened to it and he said, hey, that is the finest speaker I've ever heard. I'd like to manufacture and sell those, and I'll give you a 4% royalty. And I thought, and what is that? You know, so I went out, borrowed $1,000 on my car from the bank, and we started in business ourselves. Within 2.5 years, we were the largest manufacturer of loudspeakers in the United States. We had 7 factories going. And we were doing very well with those because they outperformed anything at any price. There was nothing that came close. We'd show them off at hi-fi shows, and the people just couldn't believe what they were hearing. And today, there is no speaker on the market at any price that is the equal of those speakers we were making, because nobody's using that design. But at any rate, and I've been in the music business for the last few years. Let's see, where was I? One of the results of being in this speaker manufacturing business was that I was running advertising in the electronics world, in this magazine and that magazine, and a new magazine was started called Popular Electronics. So I ran ads in there, and sure enough, it sold more and more speakers for me. But I knew that Popular Electronics did not have an editor. I knew the publishers very well. Bill Stockland and Ollie Reed were good friends of mine, but they needed an editor. And I know that Perry Farrell, the editor of CQ, hated the publisher with a vengeance, and for some very good reasons, and wanted to get out of there. So I put the two together, and the next thing I knew, he was the editor of Popular Electronics, where he was for many years. And that left CQ without an editor. And eventually, well, a little interesting story. The publisher said, "Oh my God, what am I going to do?" He called ARRL and said, "Who would you recommend I hire as an editor?" And they, sure enough, recommended somebody. And when he got him in there, he found that it was an illiterate farmer from Connecticut. Next thing I knew, my phone was ringing. Would you come over and talk to me about being editor of CQ? So that sounded like fun. And I had the chap who had invented this loudspeaker design was a partner, but he hadn't been doing any of the business. He'd been just busy designing things, and he wanted to take over and run the business. So I said, okay, I'm going into publishing. And of course, within 6 months, the speaker business was out of business. And he did not know how to run a business. And that's the last, anybody here ever hear of the Carlson speaker? Right? Okay, that was it. And if you have one, don't sell it for anything. They're priceless today. And if I wasn't so busy, I'd get back in the business of manufacturing them again. But I'm too busy with other new things to go back into something old. When the ARRL's so-called incentive licensing hit in 1964, and I say so-called because the whole purpose of it was designed to promote the ARRL and go back to the old Class A, Class B license, and that was what it was about. And the people who attended the meeting where they decided to do that, some of them were very upset by it and came to me and said, here's what happened. And it was done as a promotion thing. It was anything but incentive. What the proposed rules, new rules, would do is throw virtually 90% of the amateurs off voice on the high frequencies and make them go down and get a higher class license, and that was the incentive before they could get back on voice again. And the result of this was that tens of thousands of American amateurs said, I can't do that, I can't learn that all over again and get out and get a new license. And they put their ham gear up for sale for anything they could get for it, and we're selling it for 10 and 15 cents on the dollar. And this totally destroyed the ham market for over a year. And the sales of ham equipment went from $35 million down to $7 million in just 1 year. And it put 85% of the ham retailers in the United States out of business, the other 15% almost out of business. It put every major manufacturer out of business, and most of the minor ones, within 1 to 2 years. Old-timers will remember Hallicrafter, Hammerland, National, Gonset, Sidemen Engineers, Lakeshore Industries, and so forth and so on. Central Electronics, etc. All gone within about a year. And that, of course, opened the market for the Japanese equipment later on because it destroyed our whole manufacturing industry. The clubs, it also destroyed virtually all of the school radio clubs because they proposed also that all new licensees would have to operate on CW for 2 years before they could get a phone license. And this closed down about 95% of the school radio clubs within a year. And we lost the infrastructure that had bringing us hams. Up till that time, amateur radio had been growing at 11% per year for 17 years after World War II. And it went into a negative growth for several years after that. Studies made by the ARRL of the amateur radio ages showed that 50% of the new hams were 14 or 15 years old, and 80% were teenagers of the newcomers in amateur radio, and 80% of them went on to high-tech careers. And of course, the result was that the United States stopped getting engineers and technicians and scientists, and we've never really recovered. We lost our electronics industries to Japan, and I'm not sure we're ever going to get them back again. But that's where it all started and how it happened. Up till then, whenever I went around anywhere to any manufacturing company, any electronic company, there were hams all through them. Now when I go to Japan, As you know, Japan has nearly 2 million hams. When I go into any laboratory over there, they're all hams. Oh, Wayne Green, W2NSD. Oh, yes. Oh. And when I go into their research laboratories, for instance, Kenwood has one about half the size of this tent, with almost as many engineers as you have people here. And I go into the major United States equipment manufacturer, and they've got one old guy sitting there with a soldering iron. And so forth and so on. My message is, A, get youngsters into this hobby. I wanted to see a lot more kids here today. Now, you've got a lot of work to do. I want every club in Canada. Look, the future is technology. You know that. And Canada, just as the United States and every other country, are in direct competition today with today's communication and today's transportation. Your children are in direct competition with the children of every other country because it's so inexpensive to communicate and ship goods around. And that means that if you don't have the educational system that beats Singapore, Japan, China, Malaysia, India, they're going to eat your lunch. And these places have hams by the zillions. And the result is that these kids are going into electronics and loving it, and they're going into all these high-tech industries. There are so many opportunities today for pioneering. Now, as I said, in order to become hams, you had to step out ahead of everybody else a bit. Well, as I read the various books on what's going on in many different fields, never have I seen an era where you have the opportunity for pioneering, for adventure that you have today. When I saw the potential for repeaters, I started publishing articles, one after the other, as fast as I could get them, on repeaters and 2 meters. And the readers of 73 responded immediately. If you publish one more article on repeaters, we're going to cancel our subscriptions. And so I published another 100. And pretty soon I began to get letters saying, hey, you know, gee, I think you were right. Hey, this is fun. We're having a ball. Well, there is still more to do in repeaters. How many of you have used a repeater where you can switch it to 20 meters, 10 meters, 6 meters, 75 meters if you want?
You're on. We're working on it.
I did that back in 1970. I had mine so I could go out in 6 meters or 10 meters and sit there and talk to ZS's and PYs and so forth on the 2 meter repeater. Anybody else that came on could do it too. And we had a ball. I had another repeater that I just used for 20 meters so that when I took my morning walk, I could talk to people on 20 meters while I was walking.
In our rules,
and so forth. There are these things to do. How many of you have made crossband contacts? 20 to 75. I used to go down on 20 meters and get a hold of somebody in some godforsaken place and repeat them on 75 meters to the round table, and we'd all sit there and talk back and forth. I'd repeat them back on 20. And we had a ball with that. I'll never forget the excitement of doing that. And here you are on the HF bands with simplex. We should have shifted to duplex years ago. This is crazy. There are any number of ways of doing it. And you're all sitting there, well, the weather here is so-and-so, and Roger on the name, and Roger on your location, and Roger on your weather, and Roger on your antenna, and Roger on your microphone serial number. And over to you. And then I hear complaints about CB. I've heard worse language on 20 meters on 14.313 than I've ever heard on CB.
Exactly.
And so forth and so on. But there's so many things to do. Digital voice, come on. We should be on there with digital voice with algorithms to compact the information. And with that, you can send music on 20 meters legally. It's just digital information. It doesn't sound like music. You can't tell that from voice. And I've got some wonderful music I'd like to play for you. I love getting into the music business because well, as I say, I was in the hi-fi business back in the 50s. And then when they invented the compact disc, I knew that the same thing was going to happen again. When the first LPs came out, most of them were terrible. They were using 78 RPM technology and turning out really miserable LPs. And I have a bunch of them left over to prove it. So I knew that there was going to be a need for somebody to get out there and say, hey, this one's good, this one stinks. And so I started a magazine to do just that. And it soon became the largest music magazine in the United States, and with readers all over the world, actually. And I had a ball with that. And of course, that made me aware of the crooked music industry, where there are 7 major music companies that were selling 96% of all music, and 95% of the performers on those labels never made a nickel. Almost as bad as the movie industry. Crooked from one end to the other. So I began getting the independents organized. I formed the IMPS, the Independent Music Producers Society, and began manufacturing compact discs for them and getting their music out. I put out what we called samplers, where we would, when we produced a compact disc for a small record company, we would send out a group of them to some experts in that type of music and say which track is the best on that CD. And then the best track that was voted, we would put on a sampler, and each sampler had the best track from 15 different CDs of that type of music. And we put out about 125 of those samplers, and they sold that independent music like crazy because the music was fabulous. The majors were not about to be adventurous in anything. If it hadn't been done before, they weren't going to do it. Well, the independents were out there just running circles around them in new kinds of music and wonderful music. And we were putting out the samplers, and we'd put out 10 to 15,000 of each one and get them distributed, and the sales went up. Independent music went from 4% of the market up to about 14% of the market, 15% of the market, just within about 5 years. And that's several $1 billion in sales. So I think we helped that a lot. But these opportunities are out there. As I mentioned, you have all these new frontiers. Anybody here ever hear of Bill Gates?
Unfortunately.
I knew him from day one. I went down to, he was the one that came up with basic language for the Altair computer, the first microcomputer on the market in January 1975. It took me till May to get a magazine started. But in May 1975, I started producing Byte magazine with the first issue out in September. And I went down and visited Mitz, who was producing the Altair, and met Bill Gates, who had come down there from MIT. He had, from Harvard, and he had, as a class project, written an interpreter for the basic language. And when he saw that the Altair was on the market, he quick rushed down to Albuquerque and brought it down. And he'd written it for the 8008 chip. Anybody remember that chip, the 8008? Well, he wrote it for that, so he quick had to cobble it together for the 8080 chip, which was what was in the new computer. And then when the Z80 came out, he quick put in some fixes on that. And then when the 8086 came out, he put in some fixes on that and so forth. But that's how he got started. He was there first. Another chap that was there very early, Sherry and I went over and visited some fellow named Steve Jobs. Anybody ever hear of Steve Jobs? 1, 2, 3, 4. Steve Wozniak. Well, we were over there and saw the Apple computer in their garage. And Steve Jobs said, well, you think there's any market for this? And I said, yeah, you've got the first single board computer, and I think there's going to be a big market for that. And he said, well, what'll I do? I said, well, there's going to be the first microcomputer conference and show is going to be in Atlantic City in 3 weeks. Have it there. He said, I can't afford that. I said, take a bus, whatever it takes, be there. So sure enough, he was there and had a booth right opposite mine. And at the end of the show, he said, hey, I'm in business. You got me in business. I sold 20 apples. He did well. But these opportunities are always there if you are unfortunate enough to be an entrepreneur. Or fortunate. It is the easiest way and don't you forget it. Oh, stop fumbling. There are, I give lectures to college students on how to be successful in life. And there are 3 ways that I guarantee that they will never make much money, if they can call that having anything to do with success. But there are 3 guaranteed ways not to make money in life. One is to work for the government. One is to work for a large corporation. And number 3 is to teach. And you can imagine how popular this is in colleges. No, entrepreneurs work for themselves, set their own hours, decide which 100 hours a week they're going to work.
100 hours a week, yeah.
I've cut back since my retirement to half days, 12 hours. But what you do is you want to know something about a field and know where the need is for a new product, and then get out there and make it. And as I mentioned before, never have there been so many opportunities. The more books I read, the more I see of enormous opportunities. And I just brought a bag here with a couple of books I read recently, and I keep reviewing these in the magazine, and you keep not buying them. I don't know what to do with you. Now, I'm sure you're going to think I'm going to sell my own book. No.
I got it already.
Did you get it autographed?
No.
Better get over there.
A few months ago, I did a review on this book here, The Kinship with All Life. Has anybody here read that yet? Shame. This is a fabulous book, and it isn't like it's expensive or anything like that. $10 US, $14 Canada. You will be reading this to everybody. Anybody here ever read Tompkins and Bird book called The Secret Life of Plants? Been out for about a little over 20 years now. A wonderful book with endless opportunities to get into research easily. Hey, it doesn't cost you don't have to have $1 million lab to get into research. Good heavens, the leading researcher in the cold fusion field in the United States is a teacher in Vernon College, a community college in Texas, who did it in his garage on his own money, spent about $5,000, and he's a leading researcher in that field in America. Doesn't cost a lot to get into these things. And there are enormous opportunities in the cold fusion field. Yes, I know all about it being a bunch of baloney. If you believe the media and what they publish, I feel sorry for you. Because if you've ever known a story yourself and then read what was in the newspapers, you'd say, where on earth did that guy come from? You know, how did he get that bum information? The cold fusion field was announced in 1989 by Doctors Pons and Fleischmann, who were very respected professors at the University of Utah. And they had discovered that when they had a palladium, a little piece of palladium, and a lithium sulfate solution with deuterium, that if they passed a current through it for a while, all of a sudden it would take off and start generating a lot of heat, a whole lot of heat, and keep right on, turning out much more heat than any energy that had put into it, over 10,000 times more heat than could be accounted for with any known chemical reaction. Well, they went public with this, and a number of important laboratories, the scientists read it and said, hey, gee, we better check this out. Anybody around here have any palladium? Anybody got any palladium? And they say, oh yeah, we got some over here in the drawer. So they'd yank out a piece of old palladium and stick it in a lithium sulfate solution with some deuterium and turn on the current, and there was no heat. Well, Pons and Fleischmann had made a mistake, and they all had press conferences right away to show that Pons and Fleischmann were stupid idiots and had made a gigantic hoax. A few of the laboratories were able to replicate the excess heat. Rensselaer, I read in their student newspaper that they had confirmed the excess heat in their laboratory, and a number of others did, but they didn't hold press conferences. So the word was out that this was all a hoax, and the head of the DOE, Professor John Huizinga of Rochester University, published a book on cold fusion, the fiasco of the century. And the result was that the DOE had an edict that if any laboratory did any research on cold fusion, even by an undergraduate, they could not get any funding from the DOE for anything. And that totally stopped research in the United States, except for this little professor down in Vernon, Texas, who didn't have any DOE money coming into the school. But research went along very nicely in other countries. Pons and Fleischmann were understandably upset by all of this. Toyota came along and said, professors, we will build you the laboratory of your dreams anywhere in the world. Where do you want it? They have a $10 million laboratory over on the French Riviera right now, right outside of Nice, and they are just as happy as can be. Pardon? $25 million, pardon me, $25 million laboratory. A year ago, how many of you watched the program on Canadian television about cold fusion? A few of you. Okay. They had, it was called Closer to the Sun. And they had an interview with Dr. Fleischmann at that time. And Dr. Fleischmann was holding this bottle in his hands. You remember that? And they said, well, Dr. Fleischmann, about how much power can you generate with that little thing there? And he says, oh, about 10,000 watts. Oh. Well, how often do you have to replenish the fuel in there? He says about every 10 to the 5th years. For you who are mathematically illiterate, that's 100,000 years. That was a year ago. This year, Professor Fleischmann is very silent about where they are. We had a cold fusion conference over in Monaco, right next door. They locked up their laboratories and wouldn't let anybody in. I expect that within 2 to 5 years, Toyota will have a car in the market with a sealed engine that will never require fuel and probably be able to be jacked up and put in the next body for the next several generations. And think what that's going to do to the car market.
Gasoline industry.
That would be a good business to be in, making refit engines for cars with cold fusion power. The first patent has been issued. The DOE did everything they could to stop any patents from being issued because cold fusion is the same thing as perpetual motion. And that's unpatentable, no matter whether it works or not. Because everybody knows it can't work. Well, a fellow did get a patent. He got it by going through a different route than normal. He was a very old man, my age. And so they had a special track for people that were so old that they might drop dead before the patents came out. And apparently they didn't look at it too carefully, and they didn't notice that in his patent application he was claiming 2 times more power out than was going into the device. But he invented a very simple arrangement whereby he had microspheres of plastic, polymer microspheres, and he coated them with palladium and made an enormous surface area. Rather than having a bar or a sheet of palladium, he had this tremendous surface area, and in a small jar that size you can have about the area of this tent just in that little tiny capsule, that little cell. So what happened was, with that, he was able to start the reaction within minutes instead of taking days to weeks to start it. And many of the early laboratories didn't wait around for weeks. They announced the second day that the whole thing was a fake. But Pons and Fleischmann, it took them weeks to get the original reaction started. But with this new device, with these microspheres of palladium, and it works with nickel also, by the way, and rhodium and rubidium and titanium and on and on. Any metal that has a lattice-like build to it, it's put together in the lattice form, where the hydrogen can go in between the metal atoms. And what happens is that when you get 85% of that volume filled with hydrogen, all of a sudden your reaction takes place. Well, this fellow, Jim Patterson, got a patent on that, and at the Cold Fusion Conference in Monaco, he had his unit sitting there for 4 days, generating up to 6 times more power out than was being put in. And for any doubters of the thing, and scientists from 15 countries were there and checked out the instrumentation to make sure there was no mistakes being made. So cold fusion works. There are a number of different ways of doing it. One is the palladium. Another is called hydrosonics, and it turns out there was an outfit down in Atlanta, Georgia, that was making heating units for factories, and they were using a metal wheel with little dimples in it. And they spun the wheel and poured water into the dimples, and the compression generated steam. And this was a new way of generating steam. And their customers were calling up and saying, "Hey, your heating units are awfully efficient. Have you measured the efficiency of these things?" "No, we haven't." Well, they set up one scientifically with all of the instrumentation and measured it, and got 147% efficiency. So they were fairly efficient. And this apparently has something to do with cold fusion, which is really a micro fusion done on a very micro basis in small area in the metal. And not being a scientist, I came up with a proposed solution for why this is happening. In my magazine, Cold Fusion, I've had all kinds of articles from these scientists on why this is happening. And indeed, one of the reasons that many scientists believe it's impossible is because there is no theory that explains it, and therefore it can't be. Shades of Galileo. Galileo had a telescope and he couldn't get anybody to look through it. They refused to look through it because they knew he was wrong. And we had Pasteur was trying to sell germs, and they wouldn't look through the microscope. They refused because they knew he was full of baloney. Wash our hands, we've never done that, and so forth. When the Wright brothers flew their plane, for several years after that, scientists were publishing papers on why flight would never be possible. Edison, 10 years after the first flight, said flight would never be possible in public. And so it goes. But these areas are open for exploration. Here's a book called The Secret Life of Your Cells. I got so interested in the book on the secret life of plants, I got in touch with the author and talked with him, and he put me in touch with another fellow. The first book was about a fellow named Cleve Baxter, who had discovered when he put a lie detector on his philodendron that it was in communication with him. Well, this is ridiculous, of course, except that it was, and it did. And plants do communicate with people and with each other. And I've seen videos of examples of this, wonderful examples. So I called up Cleve Baxter, and he said, well, you want to get in touch with Brian O'Leary, who's doing writing up the latest work we're doing. And I got hold of that. And it turns out that if you take some cells from your body, and it's easy to take them from the roof of your mouth and put them into a petri dish and put a voltmeter on it, you'll get little readings. If you put a voltmeter on the person from which the cells were taken, you get the same readings. And if the person that is hooked up to the voltmeter reads something exciting, like a Playboy or something like that, the meter shoots over. Well, so does a meter on that petri dish, even if it's 2,000 miles away. It goes exactly in tandem. Now, of course, that's crazy, but it does. They are in communication in some way. And that helps explain why identical twins come up with wives of the same name, children of the same name, and all of these things, even though they've never known each other all their lives. Die from the same brand of cigarettes. And so forth. So it also raises a little bit of a question on getting blood transfusions. I'll let you sort that one out. But it's a fascinating book. Secret Life of Your Cells by O'Leary, Ph.D. Then that got me more interested in many of the things having to do with health. Please, whatever you do, read this book, The Secrets of the Soil, by Christopher Bird. Same fellow that wrote The Secret Life of Plants and several other excellent books. You are going to be astounded at what you find out and of the opportunities that are in there for entrepreneurs. I got a call a few months ago from a fellow named Pat Flanagan. Now, I'd heard about him when he was 17 and invented the neurophone, a way for deaf people to be able to hear electronically. And he made Life magazine and so forth. And one of the projects that he got interested in, how many of you have heard of the Hunses, the group up in northern Pakistan that lived an average of about 100 years and live on, many of them into 120, all in perfect health? Well, he was working with a chap that was researching to find out why on earth this happened. And he found out why. And he found out just what was involved, and he is selling the product as a result of that makes it so that anybody that wants to have health and live a long time can do it. And it's very inexpensive. 1 teaspoon of this in every gallon of water that you drink will change that water and change your life. But that's just one of the many things in here. I guarantee that if you're a farmer and you read this, you will never use chemicals on your land again. You will find out how to get rid of insects without them, and you will find out the difference that it makes. There's another book I should have brought called Infinite Immunity, and it's a fascinating book on foods. And it points out that all of us have the heredity of millions of years of design of our system, which was designed to eat raw food. And it isn't until the last about 10,000 years that they invented cooking. And it isn't until the last 10,000 years that most of our illnesses have come on us. And so these doctors over in France said, gee, that's almost something worth thinking about. And they tested first on animals and cats, and they found an enormous difference in those brought up on raw food and those brought up on cooked food. And so they started trying it on their patients that were sick. And they were curing every case of cancer that came along, cases of AIDS, and just about every other illness just by changing over to raw foods. It's almost worth reading about, called Infinite Immunity. Because we get sick because our immunity system falls down. And food will do that, emotions do that, pain does that, and so forth. If a spouse dies, the other one usually, or often dies within a year because the immune system is knocked out. So there are a lot of these things to learn, and opportunities all over the place for an entrepreneur. With this one here, one of the chapters talks about playing music for your crops. Well, you know, that's crazy, right? Except that they grow about 3 times as fast. And if you play rock music, they die. Kills me. The medical industry, and Joel and I had a wonderful talk on that yesterday, and I am so enormously impressed with the interest that they have in what's really going on and are not held back by fixed beliefs on things. Wonderful book called Racketeering in Medicine, The Suppression of Alternatives. A great book. Another one, Left for Dead. This fellow had a heart attack and a bypass, and it didn't do a thing for him. So he said, well, I've got to learn for myself. And he went out and he did. And the thing that he came up with, as I mentioned to Joel yesterday, was the use of cayenne pepper. And boy, did it make a difference. It's worth reading about because it apparently will help an awful lot of different things. I'm not a doctor. But that means that I'm not held back because I've tried to talk with some of these things, about these things with my doctor, and he didn't want to hear them. There are so many, as I read these and other books, there are so many areas open for research. What happens? We have people selling magnets, and thousands of cases of people have been helped by having little magnets on them. Why? How can this work? You know, if you put magnets near water, it changes it. That's crazy. But Sherry and I attended a Subtle Energies conference, and we saw a video. And they had a big jar of water with a surface tension meter on it. And they had a number of people come up and put their hands around the water. Nothing happened. A psychic woman came up, put her hands there, and the surface tension plummeted. Well, surface tension, if it's low, your body absorbs it better, and the minerals that are in it, and the colloids that are in it. And that's what Flanagan found, was colloids that made the difference. The water in Huntsland came from glaciers, which had ground the minerals up very fine and were in colloidal suspension in the water. So he makes up a little jar called crystal, which you put a teaspoon in each gallon. And if you don't believe it on yourself, you put it on some plants and see what happens. Boing, they go up. Magnets can make a big difference. If you want to know, if you don't believe that, you take 2 seeds and put them in identical cups and have a negative magnet on one and a positive on the other and watch the difference. We're talking about 4 or 5 times as much growth with one as the other. You can do this with animals. It does the same thing. The ones over at North Pole will be bright and have wonderful coats and be inquisitive and be into everything. The ones on the negative pole will have dull coats and not have any energy and so forth. And it just makes a world of difference. Now that's crazy. We know that can't be. But there are so many areas. And what does this do to people? One of the leading researchers in the world, I should say the leading researcher in the world, in the effects of EMF, magnetic fields, on people is Dr. Ross Addy, K6UI, out in California. And he sent me videos showing me what happens when you have cells anywhere near magnetic fields. And it's an ugly thing to see. And he's shown me, and I've seen videos of policemen who have used radar detectors and near their head, and the whole half of the head is eaten away, and so forth. So that's why in my editorials I recommend, look, hey, if you've got a final, don't put it anywhere near the operating position, please. Keep it away, because that's, particularly if you're on CW, but even sideband is bad. Well, it's the square waves that cause most of the trouble on that. And with electric power, if you're near a switching station, you die much earlier and have cancer and leukemia, and your kids have leukemia and so forth, being near a switching station because of the transients and the square waves. So move it away. Get a little Gauss meter, and my gosh, they're not expensive, under $50 today for a good Gauss meter, and make sure that you don't have more than about a half milligauss or 1 milligauss at the most where you're operating. And don't put up with anything more. And the same thing where you're watching television and so forth. So, as I say, again, these opportunities are out there. I can't do them all. Give me a break. Get in there and make these things happen. Get kids involved. And amateur radio is a wonderful way to get them involved in science and engineering and technology. As I said, back in the 50s, 80% of the kids in America, the newcomers, were kids, and 80% of them went on to high-tech careers. So get them involved, poison their lives with radio. And you will have the next generation of engineers and technicians and scientists that you need to make Canada strong. And I've been preaching this in the U.S., but nobody pays any attention. So you can beat the heck out of them down there. Any questions? I had about 82 more things or 71 more things I want to talk about. But any questions? No questions? Anything else you want to hear? Yes?
What's
Just talking about the effect of transmitters, do you have anything with these handhelds?
I don't use mine very often. He asked, what about handhelds? You've got your antenna right near your brain. I find my brain is more useful for thinking than to get cooked. Call me strange. I would prefer to have the antenna away a little bit, and I usually use a lapel microphone or something like that with my HT and keep it away from me a little bit. The field isn't very strong with a watt, but why screw it up? You're only issued one brain, and you've already raised hell with it, with overeating and fat and smoking and drinking and so forth, none of which is any help to it. So what you've got left, do the best you can with, and don't kill it anymore, okay? Do you have a question?
in a recent article, an editorial, you spoke about a cure for AIDS using, I believe it was electromagnetic waves.
Yes, I did write about a cure for AIDS, and I was talking with Joel about this. I hope that you will set up and have somebody test it. Good Lord. It's so simple. As I explained in my editorial, the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York published a paper saying that they had researched this and found that they passed a 50 microampere current through the blood. This prevented the HIV virus from replicating, and it died. So it's a little bit invasive to take all your blood out and pass a current through it. So a friend of mine out in California, who is a well-known physicist, said, well, you know, you don't have to take it out. All you do is all of your blood is going through your leg arteries. So just put a small voltage between your ankles and it'll go through the blood. And if you put the right voltage, you'll have about 50 microamperes flowing through there. And you do that, and they did tests and found about 20 minutes a day for 3 or 4 weeks. And at first the T cells went down and then they went shooting up. And pretty soon there was no more detectable HIV. It was still holed up in the lymph glands. So he wanted a way to blast it out of there, and what he did is wind a coil that you can put up near the lymph gland, and in order to get a nice big shot of current through it, he put it in series with a flash gun, and their used flash guns are available for peanuts. And you go flash, flash, and then run the current through your legs again. And essentially all he's doing is putting 4 9-volt batteries in series between the legs and then switching the current back and forth so it doesn't build up a resistance. The circuit is dirt simple to build, and I have not heard yet of one failure of this to work. I've had calls from people. I had a call just a few days ago from a chap in France who thanked me profusely for saving his son's life by publishing about this and sending him a little booklet on the circuit. And he said that his son was just about dead with AIDS when he started doing this, and that he has he's HIV negative now. So I'd like to see some official tests done on that. You know that the pharmaceutical companies aren't going to do it. No way. A 25-cent cure for the worst disease mankind has ever seen? No. Any other questions? Yes?
You mentioned Louis Pasteur. Do you know anything about Antoine Béchamp?
Yes, I do. Antoine Béchamp was his nemesis. Antoine Béchamp did not believe that microbes caused disease. And the latest research that I have seen substantiates Béchamp as a maligned and so as a matter of fact, I got an interesting book that I bought on the trip this time about Pasteur and Béchamp, and it points out that Pasteur was wrong. That what happens is, and if you read some of these books, there's a book called A Cure for All Cancers by Larry Lyons, and it has to do with the life of Royal Raymond Rife, R-I-F-E, who was a doctor back in the 20s and 30s who invented a new microscope that had a power about 20 times more magnification than anything that they had at that time. And he was able to see microbes being formed, and he found that they are all forming from the same basic life forms, and we're going into this type of microbe for this illness in this area, this type of microbe for that illness in that area. But he had the misfortune to test radio generators, and he found that if he tuned it to the right frequency, he could blow these microbes apart and the viruses apart. And of course, immediately what people were after him for cancer, and he was blowing cancers apart one after the other, and the FDA came in, put him in prison, and destroyed all of his microscopes. Because you're not allowed to do that. You had a doctor in Canada, Gaston Naessens. Please look for the book. It's also by Christopher Bird, on the persecution and trial of Gaston Naessens. He too invented a microscope that was much stronger than any of the others, that could observe things while they were alive, rather than killing them as the electron microscope does. And he watched these life forms generating. And he too came up with a cure for cancer using a camphor mixture that brought a lot more oxygen into the system and reinforced the immune system so that the immune system could handle the cancer. And, well, that was his theory at any rate. And they arrested him and tried him, and he brought in enough cases of cured cancer, hundreds of them, to testify so that they did not convict him. So forth. But there are groups now working with his. Please look into that too. I read these things. I know the authors. I talked with them on the phone. I've talked to Cleve Baxter, O'Leary, and with Christopher Bird and so forth, and Flanagan. They all make a lot of sense to me. None of them seem like kooks. But where does kookery end and where does it begin? We have weird things happening that are totally unexplainable in our frame of reference. And there's a book out by G. Harry Stein on 6 mind machines that you can build and operate with your mind. Of course, we know that's crazy, except if you read the issue of Wired 2 months ago, you know they had an article in there on the Princeton Laboratory for Psychokinetic Research, and they were able to duplicate they were able to prove that psychokinesis works, that the mind can influence matter, and they proved it over and over again. And so that's a little bit hard for people to swallow because we all know it can't be. But then Huizinga knows that you can't have cold fusion, and who knows better than him, the head of the DOE, and so forth. So one of the things that I ran into many years ago, I'm sorry about that. You want a chair? Well, you had to ask the question, didn't you? You could have shut up and kept your hand down. Anybody here ever read Analog Magazine? Used to be Astounding Science Fiction, and many, many, many years ago. Fabulous magazine. The editor of that was John Campbell, who was an amazing guy. W2ZGU, naturally. And he and I became very good friends, and I had lunch with him about once a month, and he had a story to tell me that it was so ridiculous that I didn't pay any attention, about a machine called a Hieronymus Machine. And with this, you were able to take a sample of metal and find out what metals were in it and what proportion they were. And the machine was made with a little coil that you'd put next to the metal, and that went to a prism of glass, which was on a vernier, and that went to an amplifier, which went to another coil under a flat plate that you felt with your fingers. And when it got sticky and you turned the prism, you'd notice the reading, and you'd know what metal it was, because first you'd calibrate it with pure cadmium, pure this, pure that, and so forth, and get the calibrations. And then you could tell what was in there and what percentage. And of course, this worked even if you turned the power off, and even if you replaced the amplifier with a schematic diagram of the amplifier, it still worked. And if you disconnected it, and you connect it with thread instead of wire, if you disconnected it, it wouldn't work. And 85% of the people that tested this would get the readings, and under double-blind conditions, nobody knowing what is connected and what isn't, and it still worked. Well, of course, they're having trouble now with homeopathy, which obviously can't work, where they take and dilute down germs by, billions to one, to where there's less than one molecule in the mixture left, and it still works under double-blind conditions. Well, that's crazy. It can't work. So either double-blind is not a satisfactory scientific approach to things, or some of these things are actually working and we just don't know why and don't have a clue. As you read more and more about these things, you'll find that, boy, there's an awful lot we have to learn. So much. Every time there's an anomaly, every time there is a spontaneous cure, don't say, that's a spontaneous cure. We don't have to worry about that. Why was that a spontaneous cure? What happened? And replicate it. If there's an anomaly, that's a red flag saying, hey, something's happening here. Look into this. Find out. Replicate it. How can somebody take a sword and jab it through them, coming out the back, and have it come back out the front again and have no scar and not bleed? That's, of course, impossible, except that it's been done and been carefully checked for, for any fakery. We have people doing mental things that are impossible. How do they do it? Whenever there's an anomaly, there's an opportunity to find out more. So you've got this world open. dig out some of these books. I'll recommend them in my editorials. And let's see, it's not quite 9 o'clock. Unfortunately, don't ask any more questions because I can go on for hours more.
That's okay.
I thank you all very much for your attention, and if you do have any questions, I'll be around all day tomorrow and be delighted to answer. Oh. I want to put in a plug for my book. This has nothing to do much with science. You also have the opportunity to slay the dragon, as well as explore new countries. And by that, what I do is as a member of the Economic Development Commission in New Hampshire, I looked into what the problems were in New Hampshire and the United States. Crime, drugs, welfare, the deficit, exploding bureaucracies, and health care, sorry about that, and education, and so forth. And I attended endless meetings with experts in these fields, read the books that they recommended, read over 200 books, and said, these are not the only solutions to these problems, but I have good, practical, inexpensive solutions to our crowded prisons, which would cut the cost of prisons by 90%, turn out prisoners who are re-educated and who have had a good time doing it. I propose a way for any bureaucracy, whether government, federal, local, or any major big company bureaucracy, will cut itself in half within 3 years and do it cooperatively and enthusiastically.